Hello, everyone. In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at pregnancy and childbirth in context. I want to note that your textbook goes into a lot of detail about the impact of the environment and things like poverty and resources and the mother on the developing child. And I want to really focus in this lecture on one factor in particular, which is stress. And though it's not a substance like alcohol or drugs, maternal stress has essentially been conceptualized as a teratogen since it can have some really detrimental effects on development. So that's why we're going to focus on it. Okay, so let's first take a look at clinical implications of stress during pregnancy. So knowing from the previous lecture and from your reading that so much is going on developmentally during pregnancy, and that as clinicians, we often encounter families in a significant degree of stress, it's important to consider the implications of this stress on pregnancy and the development of the baby. Okay, so the developing brain is affected by the nutrients and the substances that cross from mother to baby, as well as by hormones and brain chemicals produced by the mother's body in response, for example, to stress, relaxation, and emotional states. So all of those different states produce hormones and chemicals, right? And those hormones and chemicals are passing on to the developing baby. Now, of course, drugs and chemicals pass the placental barrier and they have some serious effects. They can cause mutations, they alter gene expression, and so on. And those are some things that your clients may have to deal with, right? They may also need to consider things like if they're taking psychotropic medication to manage some kind of mental health issue, is that going to have an effect on the baby? And if so, what do they do, right? But again, the one that I want to focus in on right now has to do with the stress hormone, which is called cortisol. So in the little graphic that I have at the bottom of this slide, we have a mapping of the stress response system, okay? So first, I'm gonna walk you through that, and then we're gonna talk about kind of what can happen with higher chronic levels of stress. Okay, so the amygdala first begins by activating the hypothalamus, which you can see at the top of that graphic, when the body is experiencing stress. Okay, the hypothalamus then releases corticotropin releasing factor, CRH, to signal the pituitary gland of the threat. Right? The pituitary gland is then going to release ACTH, which I hope I don't butcher this, is adrenocorticotropic hormone, into the bloodstream. This then goes to the adrenal glands, which triggers the adrenal glands to release cortisol, the stress hormone. The cortisol then travels back to the brain, and once there is enough cortisol, the hippocampus knows to stop the stress response. Okay? Now, if there is chronic stress, the hypothalamus requires more cortisol in order to stop the stress response, which you could think of as being similar to an alcoholic needing more alcohol to feel buzzed, sort of. Higher levels of cortisol also remodel circuits. For example, veterans who have PTSD had smaller hippocampuses, or hippocampi is the correct way to say that, than those of a control group, suggesting that that experience of trauma and stress had an effect on a brain system, in this case, the hippocampus. This in turn affected their ability to learn new information, disrupted functions like the ability to shift and sustain focus and concentration, made them less capable of thinking clearly about challenges, and was associated with some difficulty identifying and using coping skills. So if we think about this, in terms of all of the different potential stressors that could be experienced by a pregnant mom or by parents, there's quite a few, right? So some early experiences of adversity could be depression, poverty, having an unintended pregnancy and figuring out what to do with that, having a panic disorder. Any of those things could cause stressors that are going to then impact the developing fetus and later behavior. Okay, so for example, children whose mothers experienced 3 or more stressful events during their pregnancies exhibited higher levels of internalizing and externalizing problems. And the reason, or one way that we can kind of explain how this stress is affecting the body and how it continues to accumulate is by looking at something called allostatic accommodation. So allostasis basically involves a series of different regulatory processes that try to maintain balance in the body through adaptation. This allows for adjustments to be made within a range of possibilities across a variety of systems in order to suit the circumstances. The best balance or response for each specific challenge is found, which is called allostatic accommodation. This, of course, is influenced by the situation itself and by the person's genes. Remember that not all people respond to stress in the same way. Now, this accommodation, of course, has a cost on body and mind, which is called allostatic load. And allostatic load can be thought of as the cumulative burden on systems that need to adjust constantly to psychological or environmental demands. For example, blood pressure might rise temporarily when stressed at work in order to accommodate the challenge until the problem is resolved. When challenges are unrelenting, high blood pressure becomes maladaptive, creating a negative mental and physical health outcome. Okay. Now, this may seem really confusing. So I've also tried to apply this in a really oversimplified way to something that you may encounter in therapy. So this is part of that allostatic accommodation chart, and I've applied some specific things to it. So first, we'll start with the initial conditions. And in this case, we may have a client who is living in poverty and who maybe has a family context that isn't very supportive, or they're having to support a lot of people. Okay, maybe several children, a single parent, something like that. Okay, this interacts with their genes, the person's genes. Okay, so things like their resting heart rate, their genetic predisposition to physical issues or mental health issues, both of those things, initial conditions and genes, are interacting. Okay. Now, let's say there's a stressor. So let's say, for example, an important deadline is pushed up at work. And so the person feels pressure to meet that deadline. And let's even add in that they're maybe already on probation. So now that stress is even higher. Okay. So the allostatic accommodation in this case may be that the heart rate's going to rise in order to increase focus, and it's going to divert energy from other things. So maybe they're not going to eat, for example. Their focus is not going to be on their appetite, but it's going to be on accomplishing this goal. And so they're going to forget to eat, okay, which is common. That accommodation then causes an effect, a psychological and physical effect, which is our allostatic load. So in this case, maybe the individual's blood pressure is going to rise. Their HPA axis, that stress cycle that I showed you, is going to be activated, and there's going to be a rise in cortisol levels. Okay. This then is going to have an effect, right? And so maybe we're going to have some high blood pressure, some illness, some anxiety. Maybe after meeting that deadline, you're going to fall down. It's not fall down, but you're going to get a cold, right? All of that stuff that has now happened, that has happened to your body, is now carried over to the next stressor. So you're already a bit more activated, right? And if you then add on another stressor, in this case, like maybe the individual's childcare center closes. So now they don't have childcare, and that's a huge stressor, right? And so now they're taking all of the stress that has happened here and the adjustments that aren't super healthy that have happened in order to meet that stressor's requirements. They've now added in this new stressor. And so they're not even starting where they started at the beginning. They're starting from this place of already a hyperactive response, right? And the only way to avoid this is to be able to come back down to baseline before encountering another stressor. But as you know right now, the stressors just keep piling on. People are losing their jobs, they're losing their homes, they don't have food, they don't have childcare. And so this chronic stress is just adding up more and more and more and more and more. And the body is trying its best to accommodate at the expense of physical health and mental health. And that's where we see a lot of people right now. Okay, so that's a mapping of how that kind of works. Now, there are a few things to consider here when looking at stress and the effects of stress on the body and subsequently on the developing baby. So, if we go back to this example here, now add on this person is pregnant, right? And so now all of this stuff that the body is doing is also affecting the developing baby, right? And now they're being exposed to those high levels of cortisol and that high blood pressure and that anxiety and all of that stuff, right? And that's not healthy. Okay, so a few considerations. We'll definitely see stronger effects on the developing fetus if the teratogen exposure or the stressor occurs earlier in development. So for example, that 3 to 9 week period when a lot of brain systems are developing. Another thing, teratogen that's harmful to one person and teratogens are harmful to all people, but the outcomes that it produces in one person may be different from those that it produces in someone else, or it may have no effect. And this makes sense if you consider the allostatic load again, right? So someone who's chronically stressed and experiences another teratogen is going to have a stronger effect than someone who's been pretty mellow and calm and not stressed out, right? They're going to be a bit more capable of responding to that in a healthy way and coping with it without becoming overwhelmed or having these negative effects to their health, right? Okay. Another thing, large amounts of stress or a large amount of a teratogen like alcohol over long periods of time are worse, which makes perfect sense, right? So with fetal alcohol syndrome, for example, more alcohol over a more period of time is going to have more negative effects, right? However, also note that the effects on the fetus are always stronger than those on the mother when it comes to fetal alcohol syndrome. So folks that are saying like, oh, it's okay if I'm pregnant and I drink as long as I don't feel drunk, right? Because that means that I'm not drunk. That's really not a good gauge, because that effect of alcohol is going to be stronger on the developing fetus than on you. And you may not know, right, when it's being detrimental. So it does kind of vary. The last thing here is that negative effects can be amplified if you're exposed to more than one risk factor, more than one stressor, more than one teratogen. So an example might be someone who has precarious immigration status and is already having to deal with the stress associated with that, but then they have contact with ICE officials. That's going to compound those effects and have more and more negative impacts. Okay. All right, so this is a lot of information, okay? And it can be overwhelming or anxiety provoking for parents. So if you're telling this to your client, it may make them very overwhelmed. It could also make them really defensive if they feel like you're accusing them of not caring about their developing baby. So you may be wondering, like, what do I do with this information? How do I present this to people in a way that's going to be helpful and not harmful? And I thought that looking at parental intentions, expertise, and empowerment are a helpful way to do this. So first off, find out what parents already know and build on their knowledge, right? Invite parents to share their own expertise about prenatal development before you offer your own. Chances are they know a lot of things already and you can supplement their knowledge. You might also consider asking parents if they want advice before you give it. Maybe that's not what they're coming to you for. Okay. You want to also look for and acknowledge parents' passion and compassion for their unborn child, and use this as a springboard from which to provide psychoeducation about healthy development. If you can join with your client over their desire to have a healthy baby and raise a healthy child, then you can slip in helpful nuggets of information in a way that's not going to elicit defensiveness. Finally, two more things. You also want to individualize your discussions with your clients, okay, in order to respect the client's individual cultures and their where they are on their path to parenthood, what they value, how they see children, all of those things. You don't want to impose your own beliefs, your own values. And then finally, you may find it helpful to provide infographics, new parent support groups, or additional referrals to support your clients. And always, always, always refer them back to their doctor, to their lactation consultant, to their doula, their midwife, whoever it is that they are working with, so that they can get the medical side that you are not able to provide. Okay. All right, so that is it for some things to consider in terms of stress and its effects on the body and on developing baby. We'll talk more about this and how to convert this information into helpful psychoeducation during our in-class activity this week. So more to look forward to. All right, thank you for listening. Let me know if you have questions.